Hello and welcome to today's training, Mining for Gold in the Context of Global Change, Alternative Strategies for Successful Careers in Academic Medical Research with Dr. Bruce L. Reiser, PhD. I am Helen Heyman, Director of Programs at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. We will first kindly ask you to mute yourself so that we don't hear any background noise. To mute yourself, you will need to press the gray tab just below the red arrow. Kindly also switch off your webcam. The webcam tab is just below the mute tab. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat panel of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. You will also be able to access materials. I would now like to introduce our expert. Dr. Bruce Reiser is an R&D pharmaceutical leader, biotech founder, CEO, CSO, and an expert in cardiorenal and fibrotic disease. Dr. Reiser is also adjunct professor of biomedical research at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science and adjunct professor of medicine at the Chicago Medical School. After a career in pharmaceuticals R&D and research in academic medicine, Dr. Reiser founded BLR Bio. Its mission is to discover and develop first-in-class technology to diagnose, prevent, and treat chronic disease and cancer, the two largest killers in the Western world. Its technology platform focuses on fibrosis in cardiorenal and liver disease, skin scarring, and complications of diabetes as well as cancer. Dr. Reiser has published more than 70 peer-reviewed research articles and book chapters in the fields of cardiology, dermatology, nephrology, cancer, immunology, infectious disease, dialysis therapy, drug development, and diagnostics. He's also the inventor of more than 20 issued patents. It is a true honor and pleasure to work with this professional. I will now pass the screen along to Dr. Reiser.
I think I was on mute. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me, Helen? Are you able to hear me, Helen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll start over. Good day, everyone. I'm glad that you could join in. So let's get started. Okay, first of all, my first slide, a little bit of administrative things here, just my disclosures. I want to say that the ideas and experiences that I'm presenting are my own and not necessarily that of the university where I'm a professor or BLR Bio. Also that I have ownership in BLR Bio. As Helen mentioned, it's a company focused on commercializing technology for the treatment of fibrotic disease and cancer. And also I have funding from the sources that are listed here. Okay, in this slide, this is my vision of the academic researcher of the last century. And you see this is a smiling guy. He has funding, and he's pursuing his interest in research at an academic institute. We've now come to think of success in academic research, unfortunately, as synonymous with continued federal funding like NIH or NSF funding. So happiness then is a growing federal research budget, and this slide shows the continued increase in federal funding, particularly in biomedical research over the last 4 decades. So you can see, yeah, particularly in that one area that it really shot up. But a problem exists today in academic research, and so what I want to pursue for some time is, what is this problem? And I think that we have a number of academics that are still happy in today's environment, as shown on the left, but we also have a number of people shown in the center who are under a lot of stress on a regular basis. And then on the right, what I'm showing is we have some people that are simply overwhelmed. So why is this? Well, first, federal research dollars are shrinking. And gains were made in the 20th century in medical research, and they were huge, actually. Growing federal budgets for research in the 20th century were in great part, I think, responsible for these gains. Many medical discoveries began with research and academics, and then industry picked up on what was learned there and turned them into new improved treatments. So that was great. Now I think in the 21st century, we're in an era of instant gratification. And so the current focus by the federal government and funding is on supporting areas where the public can see an immediate need. And the other element I think that's become very important is politics and lobbying, which has probably always been there to some extent, but now it seems to play actually a huge role. So I'll let you focus on this slide a few minutes. There's some, I think, really interesting information here. After 2000, the funding in academic research became much more challenging, as becoming more challenging each year, as shown here in the slide. The top line that you see here shows the funding rate. The center line, the blue line, shows the overall success rate, and the red dotted line shows the award rate. So award rate then would be the award for a single grant, whereas a success rate just means that that academic person got funding over a period of time. So it could have been by applying for several grants, for example. And so what you see here is, after about 2001, there's been a pretty steady and significant fall, with only one period where it was leveling off, about 2007 to 2010. So all of these lines have fallen to nearly half their peak. And a real critical thing is the award rate is now only about 15%, with the success rate slightly higher. So what that translates into is a lot of difficulty in getting grants funded. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so funding at university research did not always come from the federal government, though. I think we think about that. You know, people now think that was the case, but actually before World War II, government money for research was rare, and mostly came from industry, and it was, or excuse me, the government money for research is rare. Mostly it was in aeronautics or agricultural studies. Local industry, philanthropy, and the universities themselves actually funded the majority of science and technology at American universities. By 1929, actually, more than a third of the MIT faculty were working for corporate sponsors. And this ended, of course, at that time by the market crash in 1929. And after that, then a new model of federal funding was started for science research and development. This was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, and it started out first mostly atomic research and medical, and then eventually developed into what we have today. Now, this was a big change in the way academics were funded, and so people, I'm sure at that time, experienced a real paradigm change, and they had to adapt to it. So we've grown accustomed to this, and we forget that federal funding was not always there. Okay, so as put by famous Bob Dylan in 1964 in his one of his songs, "The times they are a-changin'." So you might say that the times they are a-changin' again in 2017, pretty much like we saw after the 1929 crash. So why the big change this time? This is Bruce's view of the dynamics that are going on. This is my view. I think you'll find other people that are in this field that would agree with me. So we'll spend a little time here. So if you look there to the left, my concept is I think that the academic researcher is very good at idea generation, but in general not so good at practical application of these ideas. People in industry, on the other hand, on the right, I think are very good at the opposite, really, at creating applications for the ideas, but not so good at idea generation. So you see a gap here in the center. So I discussed earlier the drying up of federal programs, particularly for basic research, which was the heart of the academic focus. The dynamics have changed and are still evolving, but the NIH really, and this is traditionally, has funded much of the work in the universities. And this has covered a lot of basic research, and has included and has also touched on more advanced research, as shown here in my diagram. But the NIH, in the face of cuts that are going on now, really wants to see a more translational or applied research. So recently then, we've seen a shift to the right by the NIH. And when I say the NIH, I'm really referring to federal funding that would include, for example, the National Science Foundation also. So as you see that shift to the right, this leaves many more basic research programs without funding and a lot of frustrated people in academics. And I think for the government, like I said earlier, it's easier to justify to the public money spent for research when it's applied, and the thought is that the turnaround time to practical application will be shorter if they do that. So what's the solution then? What's the solution for the academic? First of all, I think it's adapting to the latest change, and that's essential to creating success in an academic research career. And there's some key elements to this. I think, first of all, that academic needs to take on a more entrepreneurial model than what they did in the past. They need to be an idea generator like they were before, but also one who can apply these ideas in a practical way. It doesn't mean you have to directly join industry or medicine. Some may do that, but you don't have to do that in order to really put this into place. But you do need to embrace and understand what industry wants and also what the NIH wants. And neither the NIH or the industry may know exactly or be able to articulate what it is that they want and what they see as translational research. So this is a challenge, I think, to anyone in the field to understand this, and I think it can and it will change. But if you can do this, I think it will open up many opportunities that really weren't imagined by the academic before. And you could take an advantage then of unique changes and opportunities in this changed and still changing world. So industry is under big changes right now, and I think it's a perfect opportunity really for the academic to step in and be able to use this. So what am I referring to? And the pharma companies and industry in general, I think, traditionally relied on their own early discovery research. But they've now eliminated virtually all of this critical function. It's really, really surprising. And I think the real reason for this is that running clinical trials and doing later stage development has become more and more expensive for a whole number of reasons. And I think most of these companies that really have to cater in a lot of respects to Wall Street really focus on their pipelines downstream, that is closer to the clinic. And by the requirement of putting more money there, they just don't have the funding to run big programs like they did in the past on discovery. And so this has really opened up a new opportunity for the academic. So the new paradigm for virtually all pharma companies are to in-license technologies. And so where are these going to come from? Well, the majority, they think, will come from universities or smaller biotechs, and we've already seen that. If you look at the number of deals that are being made now by larger pharma and companies and industry in general, it's gone up tremendously. It's a real steep curve. And so they are going out to smaller biotechs where they can do this early discovery, and they're also going to universities. Okay, so this creates a great need and a new place to fit in for an academic researcher. It's a new and great opportunity, again, for a university researcher. Related to this is that if you look at how the university views this, in the past, federal funding came with a 50% or so indirect cost that was added to whatever the researcher needed for grant money. And so this was very advantageous for the university to pay for research facilities, etc. So this was a long time gold standard at the university, and researchers were and still are to a large degree rewarded based primarily on success in achieving these. And this creates a lot of frustration now among researchers. So the university's positions towards pharma, while previously lower, they didn't regard pharma funding as being the sort of end-all in research money. That's now changing. And many or most larger universities are now creating translational centers, and they provide space for university-based startup companies and pharma collaboration. So this is now becoming what I see as the newer gold standard in university funding. In fact, there's a new innovation and research park now underway at my university, Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science in Chicago. This is a architect's rendering of what the building will look like. They just broke ground on it a few months ago. And it's not just a new building, but it's actually, I think, a new focus for the way they're going and the way a lot of universities are going. And obviously some of the bigger universities, particularly like MIT or UCSD, some of these, they've had these kind of centers for actually a long time, but now it's becoming more and more common with universities in general. And so at our university, basically we look at it with being able to gain three things. One's, you know, it's a focus on new departments that are being created just to focus on translational medicine. So instead of just trying to get some of the departments that have already been established and have their, you know, their own focus to move into this translational medicine area, this actually creates new departments. And the other idea is faculty members will share space with new biotechs. So new biotechs will be able to move into space in this building also. And I should mention this is actually just one of several that will be planned and will be added to this at a later time. The other thing that I think is very important is local pharma will be able to interact with scientists and startups at this facility. And in fact, the local pharmaceuticals in the Chicago area will be well aware of this and will have their ability to connect with these people. Okay, so in the next slide, what I'd like to talk about for a second is another thing that I think is very important to success today in academics, and that is creating collaborations. So my point here is don't be a loner. To be successful in academics, you really can't go it alone like many did in the past. You really have to establish these collaborations. And creating collaborations will strengthen any research proposal today. And today it's really almost a necessity to have these collaborations because this creates multi-areas of expertise. And so remember, there's strength in numbers, and this is no exception to that. Global collaboration academics are great also. That gives you a chance to reach out to people worldwide who are really the experts in your area. And this will also support the forming of industry collaborations. So when you go to industry and make connections with them, they are always impressed by the ability that you have to strike collaborations with people globally. And collaborations with industry will open new avenues of funding and translational thinking also. And so I brought that up before, and there's a number of ways of doing that. Okay, another area that needs to be considered is creating a company. I think first that any academic that's doing research needs to look into converting their basic research to translational research. And it may not be for everybody, but because the grant funding is going that way and the world's sort of going that way, it's pretty tough to stay in an area where it's truly basic research with no application. But if you do this, not only does this give you an edge in grant applications, it also provides the avenue for securing patent protection for your ideas. And this is something that most professors or scientists didn't even think about a decade or so ago, but many are thinking of this now. And if you can do this as you move into that area, then the other thing to think about, like I said, is to secure a patent. And university policies vary among universities, but most of them have an Office of Intellectual Property. Probably all of them will have. And many have a technology transfer office that may help also. You can't really patent concepts or natural processes in science. You need an invention that provides proof that your idea really works and it was unexpected. But if you do that, you can patent it. And university policies again vary, but most will actually pay for at least a provisional patent application at a minimum, and that holds your place for a year, so no one else can come in and patent what your idea is, and then during that year you can go out and raise funds for a full application. But there are universities actually that will pay for a patent, and some may pay for a patent in the US but not globally, and others may rarely pay for a global patent. Interestingly, I was at a meeting not too long ago. I think it was a biopartnering meeting, and I heard a faculty member at UCSD say that it's now almost impossible to get tenure there without having started a company. And I think everyone kind of chuckled. It was probably about a year or 2 years ago, but I think it's not really a joke, and I think that this is becoming more and more common in universities, and I think it's starting to be seen as actually a feather in your cap as an academic and not a distraction for the academic. Okay, the other thing is you really need to explore all sources of funding, and I've already gone into the federal and state agencies a lot, so I won't read what's here. But that's still, you know, like I said, it's still a critical area, and if you can go towards the translational, there's a lot more openings. Something I haven't mentioned so far are grants from foundations, and they will often fund projects that are difficult targets of federal dollars. Sometimes they fund with the idea that they're funding early research that would allow you to generate the data to then go to try to get federal dollars. And it could be the same to go and try to get industry funding. And they can be very topic oriented because usually these foundations have a real focus. And some projects are better than others. I've had actually very good success with foundations over the years. One of the things that can be a little bit aggravating is sometimes their budget can change frequently enough that you may apply for a grant and you may find out in the end that their budget was cut, and so they granted very few grants. But that's just the kind of thing that you need to deal with when you look at foundations. Corporations, that's something I talked about here too. So this can be a good source for research that's aligned with the market forces. Corporate funding is wide-ranging from very product-oriented to pie-in-the-sky things. And if you're going after corporate funding, it's really important to read everything you can about the corporation and try to figure out best you can, not just from reading, but also talking to people there, what their actual strategy is, what they're focused on, and you know, where they're big players, and also realize that this can change pretty rapidly in companies. There's also private donors, so look at trying to make connections and look at who may benefit from your research and then try to go to them. Also open doors and build relationships. The last thing I've got on the list is crowdfunding, and that's something I myself actually have not tried. Dr. Aaron Seitz, who I got the slide from, has actually been very involved in that, and that can be a good source of funding, particularly if you don't need a lot of funding, or you have a particularly compelling project that's compelling to the public in general. And I think Aaron may be scheduling to give a seminar, a webinar here where he'll focus on this topic. Okay, so another point here is I've talked about NIH and NSF grants in general, but there's also a set of grants called Small Business Innovative Grants, or SBIRs, and these are actually focused on translational research. And you need to have an endpoint of a commercial application in order to do this. You don't have to have that well developed, but these can start with a very early proof of concept project. It can be just in vitro data, it could be early in vivo data. And typically they involve creating a company. There has to be a company involved somewhere, a startup company. But this can be almost virtual, and it needs to have one person designated as a PI with 51% effort. So this can be the professor, or it can be somebody else that's just brought in as a PI, and the professor from academics can continue to work on this and bring in funding and remain in his normal position. There's two types of these. There's a SBIR and there's a STTR. And the difference is the STTR requires a university to be involved, whereas the SBIR does not. It can be a company out of a university, but it doesn't have to require a university. These grants are really in two parts, or even can be three parts. There's a phase 1 grant. And this is designed to be carried out in just 12 to 18 months, and these have a budget of 150 to 225,000. They can actually go higher if you get a pre-approval. So this is really just to show that you have something there, basically. And then if that's successful, a year later you can apply for a phase 2 grant that's focused on moving through completion of the preclinical phase, and for this you can get over $1 million, and you can actually come back here, I believe, more than once. One really good thing about these is they generally have a higher success rate than standard NIH or NSF grants, and they can be the beginning of the startup company that can later attract pharma or investor support. In fact, I think the funding rate in some cases has been as high as 40%, not on a single application, but if you apply and then have to do a revision or whatever, that ultimately it's, I think, about 40%. And there's many sources of help for these SBIR grants. There's actually small companies now that are focused just on specializing in helping people write SBIRs or STTR grants. There's seminars now being given all over the country to instruct you on how to write these grants and how to be successful. Okay, what I wanted to just cover kind of briefly here, more towards the end, is my path, and you can see kind of how I've touched on many of these areas that I'm talking about. I started my career in industry after a PhD and a postdoc, and went to work for a large pharma in cancer research. I worked there for a few years and then moved back to academics to explore more basic research concepts. And at the time, people said, oh, you can't move back. No one moves back to academics once you go to industry. But I found that wasn't the case, and found that other people did that also. And I think it's actually more common, much more common now than it was when I did that. I moved to Henry Ford Hospital in the nephrology department, which was affiliated with Case Western Reserve, as a senior staff scientist. And while I was there, I ran a grant-funded research program, but I also developed my first interactions with biotechs that were interested in what I was doing, and I also filed my first patents there at Henry Ford. Then I later moved, after about 10 years, moved back to industry to build on translating my discoveries that I had made at Henry Ford, and also learning the business of drug development. So I went to Baxter Healthcare in Chicago as director of R&D for the renal division to do that. And I proposed actually to them, was allowed to create an academic research lab at Rosalind Franklin. And also within this created a physician scientist outreach program. And I did this with part of my time while I was the director of R&D. And this allowed me to pursue research that was outside of the Baxter strategy. And also with the physician scientist outreach to develop collaborations with global key opinion leaders, which was helpful to Baxter, and then also became helpful to me as I later left Baxter. So in the process of doing that in the academic lab, I was able to convert outside funding that I had brought in to fund that lab, university lab. I was able to convert that to funding from Baxter. And that went on for a number of years. And this allowed us to create a novel set of therapeutic peptides in a diagnostic focused on cancer and multi-organ fibrosis. And we also were able to establish a global patent portfolio through the university's help for our technology platform, which is really essential. It doesn't necessarily have to be global to gain value, but companies now that want to in-license or partner with small biotechs are really looking for global patent protection, which then allows them, if it's working, to expand beyond the United States. And then in 2014, this work was becoming so exciting to me and time-consuming that I decided to leave Baxter Healthcare and form a company. So that was formed in late 2014. And then we also created multiple grant-funded programs with academic and clinical centers, and they're now very involved in testing our drugs in different animal models. And now with an established team, we're fundraising to move our drugs to the clinic. So we're developing data to support its use in multiple diseases, mainly focused with these academic centers, while we at the same time are moving forward to get our first drug in the clinic. Okay, so what I'd like to leave you with today is a quote. Obstacles are just an opportunity in disguise. And I'm sure many people have said this before, but this to me happens to be a quote from Deepak Chopra, someone that that I've been impressed with and been able to spend some time with. And he has a meditation that's actually free on the web that's called Removing Obstacles that addresses this. And I think it's kind of the heart of what I'm trying to present to you today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reiser, for your excellent presentation. We're now going to begin answering some of the questions submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder to the audience, you can still submit questions to the chat panel in your attendee control panel. Dr. Reiser, here is the first question. How do I begin establishing a relationship with or generate an interest from industry?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question, and I think that's something that anyone going down the kind of road I described is going to be faced with. And I think a few years ago that would have been very difficult. Sometimes it's really hard to break into discussions with pharma. But what's changed is now that pharma is really looking for opportunities in universities, one of the things that I've seen, and our university has done this, I think they've over 2 or 3 years, is they create a research, it's kind of a research day, presentation day, where you invite local pharma companies in Chicago, we have a lot of them, invite them in, and you can actually figure out beforehand what their interests are. They can then, the university can then display this or advertise this, and then the people can come in and present what they're doing in those specific areas. And that's been actually very good for me and for a number of other people. So I think that's something you can look to do. There's also now these incubators. You know, I described the one that's being built at Rosalind Franklin, but there's also independent incubators now all over, and that's one of the things that they help to do. I think in Chicago there's at least 4 that I know of. So you can look for those, connect with those. They'll tell you how to write SBIR grants. They'll tell you how to connect with industry. They'll introduce you to industry. And then the last thing I would say is don't forget conferences. A lot of academics get kind of one-tracked into very basic research conferences, and start looking at ones where you're going to have industry there. And even presenting a poster, I found, can be very good, because you'll get people from industry coming by and you can start up a conversation. So that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reiser. This is very helpful. Here is another question. You were talking a little bit about the future of NIH funding. How do you actually predict the future of NIH funding to be? How do you think this might look in 10 years down the line?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, it'd be nice if you had a crystal ball to be able to do that. I think overall you can't predict the level of funding that will come, because that can change with economics. It can change with you know, who sits in the White House, etc. I think what you can do is look at how it's going to change in terms of where their focus will be with the money they have. And there's some big areas right now, which, you know, cancer is an obvious really big area. There's other ones. I think psychology, actually, psychotherapy is now coming to the forefront. And one of the reasons that I see for that is I think medicine has advanced tremendously, and now further advances get more and more costly. And so I think we're going to see more money going into psychotherapy, and so that's something to look for. I think this translational change is not going to go away. I think that's going to be something we're going to see for a long time. So I think trying to, you know, read what the government's putting out and look at, well, what do they consider to be translational versus somebody in industry. Talk to people in industry and try to get a feel for that, so you can tune your grants into what they want.
Yeah, thank you very much. Speaking of translational, there's a question that goes as such: what does it really take to be a successful academician? You did talk about it today. If one is either very specialized on the bench, bedside, or community and cannot make the case for translational medicine, what would you recommend doing for being a successful academician if you're very specialized and cannot make the case in translational medicine?
Yeah, yeah, that's always a tough circumstance, and I've known actually many people in my career that I would consider become so specialized that they almost, you know, put themselves out of a job. And I think it's good to be specialized in that you can, you know, more easily become an expert. But I think, like I said, times are changing, and I think you need, if you're going to have funding, I mean, you definitely need to explore all these sources. And if you are going to remain specialized. You've got to know who is funding in that area. But you know, success is also being happy. It's not just being funded, but the two, unfortunately, go in academics right now go pretty much hand in hand. And so I think one that's really specialized has to look to see, well, what is available in that area. If there's not anything, then take that specialty and try to move it into an area where there is an interest. And this can often happen through collaborators, I found too. Very often going to conferences, you'll hear somebody talk that brushes on your field, but is not, you know, purely what you're doing. And so you can look at that as an opportunity to maybe merge with what they're doing, to move into an area that is fundable.
Thank you very much. Here is another question on translational medicine. If NIH does not truly understand translational medicine, then how can I understand it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I touched on that a little bit with one of the other questions. I think what somebody needs, anybody in this, you know, as a researcher needs to do is, you know, really look at, you know, how do different people define translational research, so they get a feel for it. And my feeling is the NIH really doesn't understand translation. I think they've come up with their own definition. It's not what you would see in industry. And so, and if you're going to them for funding, obviously you have to understand, you know, what their view of it is and appeal to that view. But I think their view will, as time goes by, my prediction is it will start to align more with the definition of industry. So you just, you know, you need to get out and pick that field, that topic, and talk to different people, and then come to your own understanding, and assume that that's, you know, maybe the understanding for today, but it can change as time goes by.
Thank you very much. We have another interesting question. You were mentioning the new paradigm, namely in-licensed technology from universities and small biotechs, and how pharmaceutical companies had eliminated a critical function. How has this been going? Do you feel like this new paradigm has been effective in generating big discoveries? What have been some of the bottlenecks?
I think it has been effective. One of the things that I think is maybe is a bottleneck, or potentially can remain a bottleneck for a while, is that it revolves around a couple things. One is the IP for it. Many universities don't really understand what the goal is of intellectual property, and they may not have people helping the scientists to write, because you're going to have a patent attorney that's going to write the patent, and you're just going to feed in the information and discuss the ideas, and you really have to have a good, strong set of patents, not just one that gets granted, but one that will hold weight later on. And if you don't have that, even if you have a great science, if a company comes in industry and they look at it and they see that you don't either have a patent in place, and it's now too late because you've already described it publicly, then they're going to turn away from it. So it could be a great thing, but it's basically not useful. Because even with a patent, 20 years coverage, by the time they can come in and start working with it and run clinical trials, you know, that could easily be 15 years of a 20-year patent. And if the patent starts getting older, they will turn away because they just don't want to put over $1 billion into something that then can become a generic and anyone can take it. And so that's one thing. The other thing that I've run into is industry is very skeptical about the data, often from academics, being reproducible. So you have to be able to convince them of that. And very often they'll want to repeat some key things that you've done to be able to show that it's reproducible. So those are two hurdles. But having said that, there are some really big discoveries that have come out of academics, and one of them that just comes to mind is one of the AIDS drugs that was developed a few years ago at Emory University. And I think they ended up doing a deal for $2 or $3 billion when they finally, when things were all said and done, from the pharma company that picked it up and developed it. And there's many of those. So I think they can be smaller, or they have a potential to be very large.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reiser. I think we have one last question here before we're going to end.
Okay.
Thank you very much for sharing your own experience. Could you perhaps please share a couple of tips on your experience applying for SBIR, STTR funding grants? How best to go about this?
Yeah. You know, I've been involved for a long time in SBIRs, but not directly myself, but through colleagues, and only more recently have I actually sat down and written SBIRs. But what's happened really over probably 15 years or more that they've been around, I'm not sure exactly how long, is initially, and they were actually quite easy to fund, and you really didn't have to have a very strong commercial plan associated with them, but now that's changed, and they're really looking for a legitimate company that's been formed, even though it may be very small and may have, you know, small space rented somewhere. They like to see a legitimate company. They also, I'm blanking here for a moment. Sorry. What I was going to say, but oh yeah, so they like to see a very definite commercial plan. They want to see where you're going with it, and in phase 1 it doesn't have to be fully developed, that plan. In phase 2 it has to be more fully developed, but you have to have it stated out there. And it's in my experience, it's come to a point where and I had mentioned that there are people that you can bring in, that you can hire to help you write these. And I think these people are really essential, especially for the first time you're writing one, because they know the ins and outs. They've seen a lot of grants go by. They have actually a higher funding rate than the people that just generally apply for them. And usually their charge is very small up front. They can actually take a small % of your grant if it's funded. That's allowed by the NIH, and so you can consider that. And there are a number of those people. So I would look at doing that. The other thing I mentioned was there are workshops around, and I know in Chicago, where we have several incubators, they offer workshops all the time, and there's probably some things you could just pull down on the web that are podcasts. So I would look into those first, but definitely investigate them. I've known people that will, small companies that maybe have 4 of them at one time, so it's worth investigating.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reiser, and in fact, thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and today's participants also for attending this webinar. You will receive a follow-up email within an hour that includes a link to the webinar evaluation and a link to the recording of the webinar. If you are not yet an ADAA member, please consider becoming one. ADAA offers an excellent members benefits package such as year-long access to continuing education, free access to special interest groups including peer online consultation groups, significant discount to ADAA's annual 4-day conference, promotion of your practice in ADAA's online Find a Therapist database, and much more. We hope you will join us at the Anxiety and Depression Conference 2018 taking place in Washington, D.C. from April 5th to 8th. And on behalf of ADAA and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.